We're live. Yay.
Hey.
Um, Hi, everybody. Right now, Alaina, you and I are the only two on the call. We'll see if we get anybody else in here. But in the meantime, we can kind of get going here. Um, First of all, it feels like kind of a weird time to ask people how they're doing right now. There's a lot of kind of craziness happening in the world. I'm on the internet a whole lot more, and I'm seeing a lot of people kind of in the same position that I am, where you have a lot more free time, a lot more people are asking for help, and so you're getting kind of a lot of armchair experts offering a lot of free advice on the internet. Some of it good, some of it bad. I'm not really in a position to be the judge of that, but given these circumstances, I wanted to kind of reach out to you as a real life expert and try and talk about what is going on here, how to kind of get through it, and how to cope. So first of all, thanks for joining.
Yeah, of course. It's a really wild time to be living through this right now, especially for a lot of people who haven't gone through anything, remotely like this. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yay. So I think we should start by kind of introducing ourselves and talk a little bit about how we know each other. So I'll start. If anybody doesn't know me, it looks like we have a few people joining now, which is exciting. If anyone doesn't know me, my name's Meg Murphy. I am the founder of I guess it's a company now called Chicago Superstars. We are a public database for folks looking for their next dream job in Chicago, as well as a talent community. I'm so happy to be here with Alaina Murphy, no relation, who is my roommate, although we're separate like right now, which is heartbreaking. So we're coming at you from a safe social distance, and we're going to talk about coping with COVID right now. Can you talk a little bit about like your background and just introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah. Hi. My name is Alaina, and I'm here because I'm a therapist. I do cognitive behavioral therapy. I work for a private practice in Chicago. I am not in Chicago, if you can see all the greenery behind me, currently. And my work, like many people listening, has become via the computer now, telehealth, which is, a new world for me and a different way of doing therapy. And so, so I'm here to kind of talk about therapy and coping with this, whatever people might be going through during this time.
Yeah, there's so much that's going on kind of all at once. I want to start before we kind of get into this because I've had a little bit of experience with CBT therapy, and that's sort of my only experience with therapy in general. I wanted to kind of get your hot take first before we kind of dive into like what's going on and how do we all deal with this. Like, what is CBT therapy? How is it different from other kinds of therapy? Like, can you just give me like give everyone, I guess, the high level overview of like, what is it that you do and what's the point of it?
Yeah. So there's a whole, bunch of different types of therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, often referred to as CBT, is one of them. And it's a pretty popular type that, in some ways, a lot of the interactions can look very much like more of a traditional talk therapy, in that a lot of what we do is talk. I think the biggest thing that separates it from different therapies is a big focus on behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what CBT is really what it thinks about, or what it sounds like is cognitive and behavioral. So how do the ways that we think about the world, or think about ourselves in the world, or just think in general, how are those patterns impacting the way that we feel and impacting the way that we behave? And so when we're thinking about our thoughts, for example, a lot of what we're thinking about is, both are my thoughts, the types of thoughts that I'm having, realistic? Are they working for me? Am I really fused or rigid or stuck to them? And if so, how are those things impacting how we feel? And then in terms of behaviors, how often are we engaging in behaviors, whether it's out of a feeling, happiness or anxiety, in a way that's actually in line with the things that we care about and value in the world. When are our behaviors working for us? And something we'll probably talk about later is just thinking about, control. And this is a really a time in which our lack of control is emphasized sort of more than ever before. And when we think about control, I think a lot of times people really try to control their feelings or even control their thoughts. And we have some maybe control over our thoughts. If I want to think about Meg's hair right now, I could think about Meg's hair. But there are a lot of thoughts that kind of pop into our head that we can't necessarily control. We have intrusive thoughts. We get in patterns that we don't choose to be in. But the thing that we really have the most control over is our behaviors. And so that is a big part of CBT, the B part, the behavioral therapy. And just to kind of cover the bases, although I use the term CBT, I consider it sort of an umbrella term that covers things like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, ERP, exposure and response prevention, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. Those aren't all the same things. All of those are actually drastically different. But those are all kind of under the realm of different types of CBTs, sort of.
Got it. And one thing I've always been sort of really intrigued by as we've kind of like come home and talked about our days is like you deal with patients that are sort of on a bit of a spectrum between like people that are sort of like that are either dealing with like pretty serious disorders or are really struggling in certain ways, just like whether there's big things like COVID going on or not. And then you also talk to people that really don't have sort of a diagnosed disorder, but are kind of just trying to navigate the world. Can you talk to me a little bit more about like your base of people or like who is CBT for?
Yeah, like you're saying, I think cognitive behavioral therapy can be for anyone in the sense that we are all humans and we all have thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and we all have emotion, like we all get anxious, we all struggle, and we could all use different tools or coping mechanisms or ways of understanding ourselves that help us navigate the world. And so you don't have to be necessarily struggling from something that maybe meets clinical criteria for a mental illness. And so anybody can seek therapy or benefit from CBT. That being said, to answer the part of your question about my client base, I see people throughout the lifespan, young kids to older adults. And I think CBT tends to draw a lot of people struggling with things, especially in the sort of anxiety realm. And so, yeah, I'll see people across diagnoses, but I think there's probably a lot that suffer from, struggling with uncertainty and mood stuff too.
Got it. Yeah. So this is particularly relevant, especially right now when like everybody's kind of dealing with some level of fear and uncertainty right now. Yeah. I did want to give kind of a big disclaimer before we go any further, however, that like, this is sort of for the people that have signed on, that like, this is really not meant to be any kind of substitute for real therapy or any kind of group therapy. This is kind of me and Alaina having a conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of my experience being laid off and some of the things that I've noticed with dealing with COVID, some of the patterns that I'm seeing just in talking to a few other people. But like, if you feel like you need help, this isn't a good replacement for that. And if you can, please talk to a professional. Is that a safe disclaimer?
I think so. I agree.
Great. Okay. So let's kind of dive right in here. We have kind of two big things that are going on in the world right now, right? Like, and I think the biggest thing is coronavirus and the pandemic and all the things that have kind of been triggered by that. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed, at least for my community, is a lot of people have been laid off, right? And I, fortunately or unfortunately, was laid off and kind of was able to deal with getting laid off before all this happened. So I want to sort of start with the like experience of being laid off and what that feels like. And then kind of talk about like this other compounding factor, which has triggered all these other feelings, this sort of coronavirus and pandemic and isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with getting laid off. I have my first question for you is kind of like, is there such a thing as a normal reaction to this? And I'm not sure if you want to like, I can sort of talk through like what I've seen and some patterns that I've like experienced, or I don't know, do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you go through that, and we'll kind of just go over, yeah, what that might look like for you and for other people in general, what this experience might be like, if there is a general experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I've noticed a few patterns and I can speak to sort of my experience most, like that's sort of the thing that I know the best. So for me, well, first of all, you were the first person that I saw after getting laid off, right? Like I had that meeting at 11 in the morning, HR person in the room, kind of handing me paperwork. It was a bit of a bewilderment situation going on in the room. And I remember I got in an Uber, packed up my stuff, came home and saw you, and you were like very concerned for me. And I didn't quite put that together because I think there wasn't a lot of processing that I'd done in my own head, where for about a week there, I was really, I think shock is the best word for it, where I was kind of like, no, you know what? This is fine. This is great. You know what? I didn't even want to work there anyway. Like, this is such a good, like, wait off. Everything's fine. And then after about, I don't know, a week and a half, I found myself like driving across town crying over nothing. Like I couldn't figure out, there was nothing that had happened. I was like driving to help out my boyfriend move something. And I found myself in the car, like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why I'm crying, but here I am, right? And that was actually, I think it was sort of finally realizing what was actually going on and feeling a bit of overwhelm. And that was a really sort of disruptive kind of like it all kind of hit me at once and I wasn't really ready for it. And I'm seeing kind of different patterns in people that are talking to me now too, where they're saying, you know what, like I haven't wrapped my head around this yet. Like before I can even talk to you, like I don't know how I'm doing. I'm not sure. I might need a few days, or people, or I'm seeing the flip side of it, the people that were in my boat that are saying like, no, you know what, like I'm fine. I'm really okay. It's gonna be great. Mm-hmm. Where I'm like, okay, like here we go. So I guess my question, I'll come back to this for you, is like, for experiences like this, where whether you saw it coming or whether you didn't, is there such a thing as like a normal, healthy reaction to this? And then the second part that I'd love to get to is like, is there a way to avoid that, like, that it's all catching up to me at once and I'm not ready for it moment?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's tough. I don't want to use the word normal because I don't want people to feel like their experience of their emotions isn't some way legitimate. But like you're saying, there certainly are patterns in how we deal with things, and deal with something like being laid off. I think what you're kind of explaining is this like this shock or disbelief or denial almost of what's happening. And I think, therapists get a lot of kind of grief or just like made fun of a little bit for always asking like, how do you feel? Or how are you doing? But that's actually a really complicated question. To ask somebody how they feel after they've been laid off isn't super straightforward, because jobs are a huge part of people's lives in a lot of different ways. They're intersecting with your identity, how you feel about yourself, the certain role that you have, your community. It intersects with how you're able to provide for yourself, or the lifestyle you're able to have, or provide for people you care about. And there's often a lot of ways in which people, value their jobs differently, or value what that means for them, or take a lot of pride in what they do, and for something like that to just be taken away really abruptly, and then to ask yourself or have somebody ask you, how do you feel? I think it makes sense to not really necessarily know in that moment. or to not be able to fully wrap your head around how you feel, because it does intersect with so many parts of your life. And that's different for everybody. People have different relationships with work. But I think having an emotional reaction and then feeling, probably some version of grief for, what you have lost, even if it was a job you didn't necessarily want, you are losing a lifestyle, a routine, a community, a place that you go, and you are losing a certain level of certainty. What am I going to do tomorrow morning when my alarm goes off? Do I need to set an alarm? And what comes next, and when will it come? And when am I going to get paid, and by who? And how will I figure this out? And where should I apply? And where should I start? And who do I tell? So all of a sudden, certain things that we thought were certain, we have to kind of start over with. And so I think it is, very common to feel, eventually, more of the impact of this new sort of way of existing in the world, in which questions that you thought you had the answer to are now wide open. And that, like you're saying, can be really overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really hit the nail on the head. I think after I got laid off, there was definitely a period of shame that I had to work through too, of like, oh my gosh, what am I without being a marketer, right? What am I without being a leader at a company? And I very quickly transitioned it into like building something to kind of take that place. But I think for a lot of people, it's hard, and it's totally a mourning process. I think like I definitely felt that and have been kind of working through that on my own.
Mm-hmm.
On the shame piece too, there was one conversation that I remember you and I had in the kitchen, and like specifically referring to the shame piece around talking about a transition and going into the interview process. So you and I were talking about, I was really struggling with like, how do I talk about this transition from a past employer, where my first reaction was like, I don't want to leave any room for people to think that I'm not good enough, or that like, what does it say about me as a marketer that I'm not mission critical to this business, right? Like, how do I frame this so it doesn't look like I have any fault in this? And so there's no room for people to perceive me as anything but like the best candidate ever, right? And there was something that you said to me that really hit the nail on the head, where I was just like, I'm just gonna like gloss over it, and I'm just gonna like pretend like it didn't happen, or I'm not sure exactly how I'm gonna do this, but like there's something that you really said that kind of like cut me to my core, where you're like, like, do you think that your future boss is gonna connect with that? I'd like to kind of like bring up that conversation again, because it's so it was a really helpful reframe for me, in really kind of trying to own the shame and the vulnerability and the uncertainty that comes with some of this stuff.
Yeah. So I'm certainly not a career coach or a career therapist, somebody who's able to tell you exactly what you should probably say or practice saying in order to get the job. I refer out for that, because that isn't my expertise.
Okay.
But on a personal level, in terms of shame and in terms of authenticity, I do think that a lot of times when I see people sort of trying to make things perfect, and I do this for myself all of the time, and I really have to work on it, it ends up coming off really inauthentic, because you aren't really allowing yourself to be vulnerable or have emotions or face what you are feeling, if that is shame. And so that's not to go into an interview and, spill over them and say, I'm full of shame, but to be able to really take a look at what you are feeling and process it for yourself deeply. Why am I feeling shame? Why was I putting so much of who I am into this one role? Was that working for me? Is that working for me now? Am I now seeing myself as somebody who isn't good enough? And is that going to come off then in the interview? So it's more about, from my perspective in my role, it's more about working with people through that process, which I do think shame is a very common reaction to getting laid off. But then how can we work through it? How can we maybe experience it, but then kind of fully digest it to a place where we can then confidently go into an interview with a narrative about what has happened, And, but ready to kind of move forward and be present instead of feeling like I'm going to go into this interview hiding all of these parts of me, because I don't necessarily think that will work either. How you present it or what things you do or don't say, that's not my role. But on a personal level, I do think we have to, look directly into the eye of whatever it is that we are personally experiencing.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Are you comfortable on here talking through like a few of those strategies or exercises that you work through with patients in terms of like how to get to that narrative and like find that balance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think part of the therapy process, which can be done, part of my job as a therapist is to get people to the point where they can do a lot of the work themselves. However, I do think there's always a benefit in being able to talk out loud to somebody else, and have a different perspective. But a lot of what this is the opposite of avoidance. Not avoiding what you're feeling, whether that's a physical sensation or whether that's a thought, or a lot of thoughts, or a lot of feelings, not just saying everything is fine all of the time to yourself or to other people, but really thinking about what it is that's going on for us. And generally, we're pretty bad at that, because it doesn't always feel good to really think deeply. And I think a lot of times people fear that if I really do that, then I'm just going to be stuck in this hole of misery and I'll never get out. Why would I do that?
Yeah.
But the point isn't to sit there and stay there forever. The point is to kind of go through it to the point where we can learn from it, and then kind of go out in the world with more insight into the things that we actually care about, and how, into who we are and how certain things impact us, and who we want to be. And so there is a bit of a trick to being able to kind of observe what's going on without also falling deeply into a place where you feel super stuck. I think people fear that, though, more than it ends up ever being a reality for a lot of people, because a lot of people who end up feeling stuck are also avoiding a lot of things. And so anyway, in terms of a practical strategy or practice, this is essentially what mindfulness forces you to do. Right. So practicing mindfulness, being sort of a curious observer of what is going on in your head, what is going on in your body, what emotions are you experiencing, how are you processing this, is essentially a mechanism for learning to get to know yourself, and to not avoid.
That makes a ton of sense. I love that. Are you ready to kind of tackle the COVID problem? Because this is kind of I'm seeing, so I was, as I mentioned before, like, whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not sure, to be able to like go through a lot of the sort of processing that needed to happen around my layoff, like before a lot of this happened. And now I'm seeing, especially in kind of building Chicago superstars, and seeing a lot of people, even people that I helped place before, now saying, oh, I've been laid off again. There's kind of a COVID triggered layoff process where tons and tons of people find themselves both in sort of the uncertainty that comes from just being isolated and distant from people, and not being able to do the like weddings and parties and fun things that we used to love. And now having this sort of layered on, like, where am I going to get my next paycheck from? How am I going to sort of find my identity throughout this process? So maybe just kind of like keep it a little bit cleaner. I'd love to talk about sort of COVID. I'm sure this is something that like you're talking a lot about with your patients and with sort of the other therapists in your group. I guess I'll ask the same question. Is there such a thing as I won't use the word normal, but like unexpected or like, I guess expected reaction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a crisis, it is expected to feel fear and anxiety. And I also think people are experiencing, like you're saying, a lot of grief. And I think those things are in a sense, unavoidable at this point, for really everyone. And I think we're all facing various stages or, extremes of these things. We're all being impacted by this pandemic in different ways. Personally, as a therapist, it's been interesting to be going through, be impacted by the same stimulus that is impacting all of my clients at the same time. My life is changing too. I am also part of this. My actions impact others, and others impact, and so that has been an interesting experience. But yeah, I think, when we're, like you're saying, I think a big word here, the two biggest words are probably uncertainty, which, always is part, I think, of fear and anxiety, and grief. So I think people are grieving a lot of the losses, the loss of their normal life, the loss of certain events or activities or ceremonies or rituals that they were looking forward to, the loss of people, the loss of a sense of security that you can go to the grocery store and be safe, the loss of routines. And so there's a whole lot of grief that I think people are experiencing to various degrees. And then uncertainty, what's going to happen? How is it going to impact me? When is it going to impact me differently? If I lost my job, when am I going to when are companies going to be hiring? When is the government going to, provide me with any type of relief? How is, how are any governments or any systems going to respond? What's going to happen next? Is this going to start to, is the curve going to start to flatten? All of a sudden we're flooded with all of these questions, and we're looking, to all sorts of people to answer them. And overwhelmingly, even the best experts in the world are telling us, well, we're not quite sure. And that is the best answer that they can give. And so we're faced with a whole lot of uncertainty. And dealing with that is difficult because people typically like to have some sense of everything's going to be okay. It helps us wake up and go through the day. And on some level, uncertainty is the most natural part of life, right? We all are going to die. Everybody that we love is going to die. Bad things are going to happen to us, but we aren't faced with this so frequently in the news on our phones, and faced with the reality that our lives have changed so frequently all the time, every day. And so it's sort of this escalation of uncertainty for everyone. So yes, to have a reaction of fear, anxiety, grief, is very common.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, and I think there's a sort of different levels for everybody. You touch on a few things in there that I think are like really true, especially for me. We've had a few weddings that have now been canceled. I'm concerned for the health of my family, especially people that are older than me in my family. We've got nurses on the front lines, right? There's so many things that personally I'm worried about. And then there's just this deluge of information and over information. And like I mentioned before, a lot of armchair experts that are kind of saying, well, this is how you should handle it, which makes for a lot of I'm not really sure where to turn, right? In a lot of moments where maybe it's too much information, maybe I need to turn it off. Mm-hmm. Let's start with you said two big words in there, sort of grief and uncertainty. Mm-hmm. Let's start with the grief side, since that's the first part that you brought up. What would you recommend for people in terms of coping with grief? Do you have a framework that people generally work through? A very high, I know it's the most broad question ever, but how does CBT sort of handle grief?
Yeah, grief is hard. I think especially for me, as somebody who sometimes likes to feel we can fix this. Yeah. With grief, I can't give you back what you've lost in any way, and there's no strategy for that. Mm-hmm. and it's really hard because grief is one of these things where you really do have to go through the process.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, and to give yourself a little bit of patience, this is, an acute moment of grief. We don't know exactly how you're going to feel about this, as time passes. And in the moment, we often feel, different than as time goes on. And processing it in the moment might look different than how you process it a couple months from now. But I think the same strategies of not denying yourself your own experience are helpful. Reaching out to other people who you care about, whether that means you have to get really creative and do that virtually, I think is really important. But I think, the biggest thing is trying to figure out, how to focus on, and this goes for the uncertainty piece more, but focus on the things that are in your control.
Yeah.
There's so much right now that so clearly isn't in anybody's control. The virus isn't in our control, how it's going to impact us, whether or not we lose our jobs, the timeline when we can go outside. Like, none of these things are in our control, but we can control what we're doing in the moment. And what we care about kind of doing that day. But yeah, for grief, it's a tough one. I mean, there are models for, going therapeutically, going through the stages of grief. But typically it's a kind of up and down long-term process. I think one thing would just, that you could do yourself would be educate yourself on the stages of grief, understand that it's not linear. It's made up of a whole lot of emotions, and you might cycle back and forth through many of them at different times, and that's okay. But to, again, allow yourself that experience.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And the control piece is one that we've kind of touched on a few times. Like, that's sort of the first thing that I go to too. Like, I think I'm kind of in the same boat where, like, I like to be able to fix things, right? Like, that's probably the most debilitating part for a lot of this is like, there's not much anyone can do. But in the spirit of controlling the things we can control, I'd love to kind of switch to some coping strategies. So I kind of have like two high level questions here. I guess there's kind of like in the moment things that I'd love to chat with you about, and then kind of like broader, how do we avoid these like moments of panic, right? So I find these moments, as I just sort of exist right now, right? Like, there's moments where I'll be whatever, working out or trying to focus on something, and I'll have just like these moments of like, everything is awful. And how do I like kind of get myself out of moments like that? And then the second piece is how do we all kind of think about how do we set up our lives in order to avoid moments like that?
Yeah.
We'll start with like whatever you think.
Yeah. So I think the big sort of mindset is to be able to start to acknowledge when what you're thinking about, ruminating about, doing is or isn't helping you, working for you. Is this making me feel better? Is this making me feel closer to my values or not? And a thought perspective, especially right now, I think it comes up with the news. How much news is the right amount? And there isn't a right dosage. I think the right dosage is individual, but it's, being able to understand, okay, is this getting me enough that I feel informed? And, in some ways knowledge can be power. But then where's that line where all of a sudden I become so anxious because I have so much information constantly? And being able to kind of, take in the amount of news that ends up working for you. But, I think what it is, that takes an acknowledgement of how you're feeling in the moment. And if you end up kind of tipping the scale and going off into the like, okay, now I'm panicking, now I'm really nervous, now I'm really anxious, and I'm ruminating about the future and all the things I can't control, then how do you get yourself back? I mean, one thing is to get yourself, take a couple deep breaths, and understand that in that moment you're in your head and you're not really in your body or in your, experience at all. You're not really in your life. You're living, in your head, probably ruminating about all of these things that are out of control and uncertain, and you're not getting any closer to an answer. And so, one way to get back into your body, could be engaging in some type of physical exercise or moving yourself into a different room. But another way could just be really like focusing on your senses. So going, looking around the room and, figuring out, wait, what are 5 things that I can see? And maybe pointing out 5 things that you haven't really looked too clearly at before. And maybe 5 things that you haven't, really noticed the color or the texture, and, some things that you can feel and actually like touch them and feel them, or like smell them. In the room, sometimes people are like, I can't smell anything, and I have them, smell their armpits or something. Like, taste, what can you taste? And so really just getting, like, activating your senses so you start to come back into kind of this real world, and then engaging in the present. So what is actually happening in your present moment? Are you watching TV? Maybe, but like, are you really actually engaged, or are you in your head? Are you having a conversation? If so, like, can I focus on what this person is really saying and how they're saying it and the tone of their voice? And so really trying to ground yourself in the present moment can be something that you can do when you're sort of already off of the deep end. Journaling, is another way, sort of like mindfulness, which could be both a short-term and I think long-term strategy of really facing your thoughts and noticing what's there, expressing it.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And I love breathing as a recommendation, especially. We've talked about this a few times. Can you explain really quick? You've used the term belly breaths and not just like normal breathing. Can you just like give us like a high level overview of like, it's not just like regular breathing and like in and out, like what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think people get so annoyed when you're like, well, just take a breath, just breathe.
Yeah.
And I get it. Because it's like the world is falling apart and you just want me to breathe. Like, that's what I'm trying to, not stop doing. And so, so basically a lot of times when people say take a breath, you realize like your chest goes up and down, but to kind of do diaphragmatic breathing, which is, is more calming essentially, is you are sort of breathing into your belly. You're taking deep breaths. So instead of your chest going up and down, you're having a, sort of deeper flow of oxygen. You're noticing your stomach actually go in and out. And the biggest thing I think to pay attention to when you're doing that, not only is like, are you breathing just shallow kind of into your chest, is also the pace and the rate. If you're anxious, you might realize that the rate of your breathing has kind of changed. Maybe it's gotten really almost stopped, or maybe it's, really quick. So focusing on really slow, deep breaths. You don't have to do this forever. You could take 4, like 8-ish second breaths and you're at a minute, and you might feel different, but just giving yourself the opportunity to slow your body down and kind of physically relax. I often tell people I never see anybody in therapy who's really anxious just like lounged out on the couch. Typically anxiety manifests physically, and you see it in the tightness and the way people are sitting, and so giving yourself the ability to just kind of shake it out and actually physically relax might actually be easier than getting yourself to, in the moment, just stop thinking that's often not going to work.
That makes a ton of sense. And then what about like avoiding moments like that, right? So like one of the big things that I've noticed in like getting laid off is I lost my routine, right? I no longer have to be at the office a certain day. I don't have to put on I figured out how to blow dry my hair, but like thank you for joining me, because like this is an excuse to put on some makeup and like wear my nice leggings,
Yeah.
What about like, but there's also like, I notice a lot of like, there's a lot of good things about having that routine that I kind of have lost in this period of time. Are there things that you recommend to clients, or like things that sort of therapists might recommend to kind of keep people feeling like there's some sense of normalcy and certainty in this time? And ways that we might sort of avoid getting to those moments of full on panic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think routines are really helpful just in general for humans to function. Not that this routine has to be incredibly rigid. I think that probably isn't helpful. Or that it has to, include 4 hours of exercise and you always have to have makeup on, or, there's that funny meme that like the guy standing in the New York subway, like pretending in his bathroom. Like you don't actually have to go through all the motions that you normally go through. But having something that works for you, some sort of sense of responsibility that you're putting on yourself, because what gets taken away in this is sort of purpose.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, especially when you lose, like, what am I working for? Why am I getting dressed? What am I doing? And we kind of have to forge that for ourselves in these periods. And it doesn't necessarily mean like you have to come up with this grand purpose for living, but my purpose for this moment or this hour or tonight or today, like, what do I want to get out of this time that I have? And it doesn't have to be, again, anything like noble. Maybe you really want to work on relaxing, but I think we do have to come up with some type of routine so that it, helps us work toward that, because we're not generally really good with unstructured time.
Yeah.
And typically what happens with people, that I see is often when time becomes unstructured, you have the opportunity to make a lot of choices that aren't actually in line with your values. It's easier to do that. And then you end up feeling really regretful or bad about yourself for not, ending up working towards something, and you feel really purposeless. And that is just, a bad cycle.
Yeah. I think that makes a ton of sense.
But in terms of routine, like things to include, like I would include exercise if you can. I would include trying to get outside if you can. I would include eating. The big thing I would include is a regular sleep schedule. Like, and I tell people all the time, just get up at the same time every day. I care about that more than the time that you go to bed. That time will eventually kind of regulate themselves. I think people's sleep schedules have gotten really thrown off during coronavirus, and especially probably during layoffs when you don't have a time that you have to be somewhere. But if you wake up at the same time every day or roughly every day, generally your system ends up being more regulated and you feel better.
I think that makes a ton of sense. These are great advice pieces. I've kind of run out of questions. I see Dana in the chat asked a question about panic attacks and coping mechanisms. We kind of touched on that a little bit in terms of like moments of panic, but I think a panic attack is a little bit different than like a true panic attack is, I think, a little bit different than a moment of panic. Do you have coping mechanisms for like full-on panic attacks as well?
Yeah, so a full-on panic attack is different than, I think we kind of often just like use the word panic attack sometimes when it doesn't mean panic attack. I don't know which version she's talking about, but when you are experiencing a full-blown panic attack, in which you're experiencing 3 or more of a general set of symptoms. A lot of them include like really fast heart rate, difficulty breathing, a lot of different sensations that are happening in your body. This is different than just kind of freaking out and saying, okay, I'm panicking, like I'm really anxious. Actually, there's something like 33% of the population can actually, can only that percentage can have a full-blown sort of panic attack, as far as the research that I know. Like our bodies can't all produce the same, like a very, very overwhelming sensation. Tightness of chest, things like that. So anyway, if you are experiencing panic attacks, that is something that you can treat. CBT is something that's good for that. It's a really counterintuitive treatment in which we a lot of times work on, and I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing this alone, but sort of inducing some of the same sensations, whether that's making your heart beat really fast or spinning you around in a chair so that you sort of feel dizzy or feel out of control, or making you breathe through a straw so it feels like you aren't getting enough air. One of the things that people worry about with panic attacks is, what if I faint, or what if I'm not getting enough air, or what if this is, what if I die, what if this happens at a terrible time. And it isn't actually, the actual physical experience of a panic attack isn't fatal, although sometimes it can definitely feel like it. So actually what we end up having people practice is kind of getting habituated to this like physical sensations of it, and then actually practicing allowing it to happen, even saying, I can't wait for this panic attack, I hope it happens, because the opposite of kind of panic is sort of acceptance, is letting your body experiencing it, both cognitively and physically. Once you have that sort of shift in mindset and can practice it physically, the panic attacks often stop coming or come much less frequently. And when they happen, they, don't always last as long. And so that, that would be an actual treatment, an outline of what it might look like for panic attacks. I would recommend reading the book Don't Panic. It's really the best book on this topic. And then in terms of just general like feelings of panic in the moment, I would, I would do something to calm down. I would do something like go for a walk, or if you can, or any of the breathing things that we talked about. Take a warm bath. And that, to me, that's not necessarily avoidance. If you are really just kind of freaked out in the moment and it isn't necessarily a time when you can really like dig in deep, like get yourself a little bit relaxed, take some deep breaths, and then, face what am I thinking, feeling, experiencing.
Yeah, get yourself out of that like panic mode and into like, can I think? Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm out of questions. It looks like our chat is out of questions. This was really great for me, if for no other reasons than to get some like really helpful reminders, and to like see your face. We've been doing some happy hours, but not enough.
Oh, it's nice to see you.
Yeah. So thank you, and thank you everybody. We'll be sending out. I'll add this to my YouTube channel and I'll send a link out to everyone. But we'll talk soon.
Okay, awesome. Bye.
Bye.